Welcome. This is Teaching Restorative Practices Through Games and Activities. Thank you so much for attending this presentation. We're honored to have you here. Before we dive into the material, and we're going to use this time to talk a little bit about why we teach restorative practices in this way and how, and we'll be introducing you to a few specific games and activities as we go, with information on where you can find instructions to bring them to your community, including in our book. But before we do that, we just want to take a moment to introduce ourselves and share a little bit about why we personally love teaching restorative practices in this way. So first, I'll just say I'm Lindsay Pointer, and one of the things that I love about teaching restorative practices through games and activities is it allows you to approach the teaching or training role as a facilitator. So rather than just sharing all the information and trying to kind of get across everything, you are setting up a space and an experience that allows people to have a really rich and meaningful dialogue and to really learn from each other's experiences and perspectives. And so an example of that, we have an activity called Build the Nest, which speaks to kind of structural inequities and how they relate to crime and conflict. And that's a really big, complicated issue. But when we use an activity, we allow learners to have equal voice and to really learn from each other, and their kind of experiences and perspectives are brought into that space. And through that dialogue, we can really go deep. And I end up learning something every single time we run that activity and every activity that we have. How about you, Kathleen?
Hi, thanks, Lindsay. I'm Kathleen McGoy, and I really love teaching restorative practices through games and activities because I think teaching this material is challenging and learning this material is challenging, whether you're working with adult volunteers who are trying to become facilitators of restorative justice, or you're working with youth students who are using a restorative approach in their school. Sometimes learning this material feels really great, and sometimes it can be really confronting. And so I really love that using games and experiential learning helps to elicit some of the same emotions and reactions that we will have when we're actually using the tools. But when we're in the middle of a game, there's more space to work through those reactions or emotions in the moment, and then later to look back and see, okay, so where was I strong, or where do I need some more growth and improvement to be able to handle these difficult scenarios? I also believe that we're at our best when we acknowledge that restorative justice and restorative practices work is human-centered, right? That's why it's so important to bring our full human selves to our roles as teachers, as facilitators, which means being serious, taking the subject matter seriously, and also being playful. So a game that we really love to start the day with, that's described in our book, and we also have instructions online for how you can use this game virtually, is SIA. SIA is a game that really gets people warmed up. It starts to build connections between a community of strangers, or people who already know each other well will learn something new about each other. And so that's a really great way to start the day, to build up and scaffold towards an activity like Build the Nest that Lindsay referenced.
Absolutely. Great. So we want to start by just talking a little bit about restorative pedagogy, which is a conversation happening wonderfully in the field in a lot of different spaces now. So when we talk about restorative pedagogy, we're talking about this question of how should restorative practices be taught? How can we be using the values, the principles, the approaches of restorative practices in how we teach this work, whether it's in a training context or in an academic classroom? What teaching structures and methods are most appropriate when we're talking about forming that restorative pedagogy and staying in alignment with values. And it's interesting to consider a restorative approach to teaching in contrast with kind of this more standard, what's called the transmission model of teaching, where the teacher transfers knowledge to the student as if pouring water into an empty vessel. So in this model, the teacher is really seen as the only one with information to share, the voice that's most worthy of being heard in the learning space. And if we consider this model from the restorative practices framework, there's a few problems with it. There's a few ways that it just doesn't align with the type of values and spaces that we're trying to create. First of all, it's really hierarchical. So it creates space and it values the teacher's voice above the students or other people in the classroom. It encourages a really passive role for students. So they aren't learning through doing and engaging. They're kind of just sitting back and absorbing. And there's little opportunity to collaborate, to share individual experiences, to really have that equal voice that allows us to learn from each other in a classroom or in a training. And it's interesting to notice the structural similarities between this kind of standard classroom approach and the court system, where there's kind of a really stark hierarchy and ideas around whose voice is valued, who's going to determine what's right, communicated even just by the kind of physical structure of the space. So interesting to note that in kind of both of these spheres, we're hoping to really subvert that hierarchy and that unequal distribution of power and work on something much more restorative and engaging and relational. And in kind of our approach to thinking about restorative pedagogy, we are learning from so many people who have come before. In particular, we've drawn a lot on critical and feminist pedagogies, in particular Paulo Freire's work and some of his ideas around having teachers and students be constantly in dialogue and learning from each other and really breaking down that student-teacher dichotomy as a way to understand oppression in the world and to kind of break down systems of oppression. And Bell Hooks, this is just one example of a book of hers that we read. We read many, love everything that she writes. And she adds kind of an extra relational lens to this work of, how can we specifically consider race and gender and nationality and sexuality? And she makes this wonderful effort to get to know and communicate that she's valuing each of her students as individuals and have that relationship be kind of the guiding compass to the classroom environment. So, both of these people and others are, great thinkers who have really thought about this. And so when we're thinking about what does a restorative pedagogy look like, we can be learning from these other approaches to teaching that have helped to kind of break down that hierarchy and that transmission model. So I'm going to share another model to help us think about what a restorative pedagogy looks like and what we need to be considering. But first, I'm going to ask you to take a moment to reflect first on what has been your worst learning experience. So what's something that just didn't work for you at all? What made it the worst? And reflect on your best learning experience. So what was that kind of amazing class or amazing training that just worked for you? And what made it the best? So just take a moment to reflect on that. Bring both of those examples to mind. So with those examples in mind, I want to bring this model, which this comes from a article from Christina Llewellyn and Christina Parker. They kind of talk through these 4 different classroom types, though the visual is actually mine, just putting it into a graph like this. So what they talk about is how classrooms can have different combinations of either minimizing or maximizing conflict dialogue, which is encouraging kind of in-depth dialogue about the important issues. So what are like the big social issues that we need to be tackling in order for education to be truly transformative? So it can either minimize or maximize conflict dialogue, and it can either have controlled relationships where it's kind of, there's not a lot of dialogue, not a lot of back and forth, not a lot of getting to know each other as people, or it can have really close relationships where we're having that chance to kind of see and value and hear from each other as individuals and bring our experiences into the classroom. So you can have 4 different kind of combinations of these factors. So for an example, if you have controlled relationships and you're minimizing conflict dialogue, then that might look like that kind of standard lecture format where someone's just talking with a PowerPoint, which I understand, unfortunately, that's a little bit what's happening here, but hopefully we'll have more chances to make relationships with all of you when we have kind of our live Q&A, which I hope that you can attend. And so we have, little relationality, little chance to get to know each other, and really no opportunity for kind of those in-depth conversations that are really going to start to be able to allow us to see society more clearly and transform harmful structures. If you have kind of a controlled relationship but maximizing conflict dialogue, that might look like maybe you've had a professor who's trying to start the conversations about the big issues, but there's no trust and safety built up. So people don't really engage with the conversation, or maybe they do, but in a way that feels kind of shameful or unsafe because there isn't that first experience of trust and safety built up to be able to have that in-depth conversation. And then what I would say is this kind of idea of close relationships but minimizing conflict dialogue is maybe what I see most often in restorative practices trainings in classrooms, where we're really good at using our tools, using the circle, using kind of one-on-one conversations to build trust, to build relationships, and you end up feeling really warm and fuzzy and like you found your people. But we ultimately haven't had conversations about kind of larger structural inequities, about racism in class and how all of that is contributing, and how the work we're doing as restorative practitioners is part of that. And so we're missing this opportunity to have these great conversations and to really be reflective about our work because of that kind of hesitation. So in a truly restorative classroom, what we want to do is have close relationships and also be maximizing that conflict dialogue. So we're having that trust, safety, relationality, but we're also really encouraging dialogue to dive into those most important issues. So just to give a quick summary, when we're thinking about restorative pedagogy, we're thinking about something that builds relationships, that creates safety and trust, that encourages respectful conversation about really important issues, in which the teacher is the facilitator who's learning alongside the student. So we're breaking down that kind of teacher-student dichotomy and equalizing that. It needs to be experiential. So just like in restorative practices, you're kind of setting up the experience and then people are bringing their own needs and distilling their own learnings from it. It needs to be, a chance for them to learn through doing. And it needs to create an opportunity for equal voice. And the great thing about games and activities is they really naturally kind of hit all of these points. So they're building relationships, they're creating opportunity for dialogue, they're experiential, and they're kind of bringing everyone into the experience together, students and teacher alike.
Great. Thank you, Lindsay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of preparing to facilitate. In other words, preparing to get in front of a group of learners and facilitate an experiential learning activity. And so this is divided into two sections: the need to know yourself and the need to know your learners. So in terms of the need to know yourself, we encourage a serious and deliberate process of self-reflection. So yes, acknowledge that you bring a certain expertise, hopefully, to whatever you're teaching, but also you're going to have, to some degree, limited perspective and your own set of biases and assumptions based on your experiences. None of us can say that we can fully relate to this material from every different perspective out there. And that's the richness of this learning environment, this community of learning, is that you as a teacher can acknowledge how much you know, and also acknowledge that your learners have incredibly valuable experience to bring to the learning process. So we want you to get real about that. And an example of how important this is the last activity that Lindsay and I released last month, because we are sending out to our mailing list a new game or activity each month. So please join our mailing list. And because we wanted to do something relevant related to what is being talked about all over the world in terms of systemic racism and inequity in our systems, we did an activity based on Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, which is really meant to look at that book and then have an experiential activity to deepen learning. And that is an activity that should never be facilitated unless you have taken the time to do some self-reflection first. All of us have blind spots, and this particular activity we recommend doing it in white affinity groups, so groups of learners who all identify as white. We reference in our book the norms and ground rules for creating brave spaces, which is basically a way of facilitating what Lindsay just described in generating conflict dialogue while also creating a brave space for people to speak honestly and to be confronted by themselves or by other learners about what they might not be aware of in their perspective and their experience. We also offer in the book a few practical tools to facilitate your own reflection and evaluation. We reference Annie O'Shaughnessy, who offers this mindful pause in restorative practices, and also Barb Taves, who provides very specific steps for conducting a self-reflection or a self-evaluation during and after the experience of teaching and training others. And I'll just mention now that these processes of self-evaluation and self-reflection will be more honest if you can engage with a peer. So engaging with somebody ideally who's been teaching alongside you and has been able to observe, or somebody who's been a learning, a participant in the learning environment to help you to get deeper into your own experience, and be able to see things that maybe you haven't seen on your own. Then next, oh, and of course, this question, we wanted to invite you to reflect for a moment now. What is it that you do to prepare to facilitate? Whether you're going into as a facilitator of a restorative process or you're facilitating a learning experience, what helps you to take that break, take a pause, and be ready to go into that role? And here are just a few fun examples. Here's some insight into behind the scenes with Kathleen and Lindsay. You'll see Lindsay here enjoying nature. I also put that cup of coffee on there because I know Lindsay will drink tea, whereas I will drink coffee. And it can be that simple, right? Just taking a moment to separate between, let's say, your morning appointments or your typical workday and shifting into your moment of teaching. I'm also a person who practices Qigong. That's that picture movement meditation form. And then also this picture of me laughing hysterically with my coworker, Jessica, to highlight the need to make sure you're in right relationship with the other people that you're teaching and training with. The second part of preparing to facilitate is, of course, the need to know your learners. So recognizing that when you are teaching restorative practices, often you're introducing to some degree a paradigm shift that's going to challenge people's inherent beliefs about how to learn and how to see and operate in the world, because so many of us are programmed with this default towards a punitive response. And so allowing your learners to also face that paradigm shift and recognize that it could also bring up some inner conflict, or reflecting on something that they really don't like, how they've been, how they've acted, how they've treated others in the past, and generating a space where that is not negative, that is fruitful, that is a really enriching place to have a learning experience. It's important to prepare beforehand and imagine what might come up from your learners. Then being prepared to present that inner conflict as an opportunity. There's an opportunity there for, one, taking responsibility, and two, realizing that there's choice. There's a choice to step into the discomfort and look at our previously held beliefs and assumptions, and to challenge those honestly, to take responsibility for them, to not stay stuck in a place of shame or self-punishment, but really say, okay, reframe that as, wow, this is something that I always did or something that I always believed, but really I'm empowered, I have agency to see this and handle it differently moving forward. That's in line with practicing fidelity to restorative practices, where we acknowledge that there is no one truth with a capital T. Each of us has our own stories. Each of us has our own truths. How can you, as a teacher, facilitator of a learning experience, acknowledge and invite a space, a brave space for us to see that we're not all going to agree with each other, and that's okay. There's learning to come from that reality. We also really encourage looking at Dan Siegel's window of tolerance. There is a point where learners can cross over a line of their comfort zone and go into a place where they might be sort of hyper aroused, so getting really escalated, or hypo aroused, where they're going to kind of start shutting down. And maybe that's an expression of going a little bit outside of their comfort zone. Or it could be a trauma response. It could be something coming up that's going to require attention outside of the group setting. So we really want you to have a lot of tools to equip yourself to be able to look for those signs and invite learners back again and again into a space where they can learn and they can internalize new information. One of the ways that we draw from bell hooks, again, is bell hooks talks a lot about the importance of bringing love, compassion, humor, and humility into the classroom. And even when she, and we've experienced this too, have been really challenged by some of the comments and opinions of learners in an environment, how can we sort of open more to that? How can we be more patient, holding a boundary to make sure that there's a brave space, but also loving our learners, not shutting them down or shutting them out? And often humility and humor can play a role in that. And when I say humor, I don't mean joking around to minimize something that's difficult, but how I can demonstrate a little bit of laughing at myself that I am also imperfect in this process and I have more to learn, and setting that model example for your learners that they can also take themselves a little less seriously and open their hearts and their minds to something new, to this paradigm shift.
Thank you, Kathleen. So the next thing we want to talk about is, in the little book of restorative teaching tools, we offer a variety of kind of already designed games and activities to fit different learning needs that you may have in your community. And we have even more on the website. And like Kathleen mentioned, we're coming up with a new one each month. But we also offer this kind of guidance for designing your own game or activity based on the specific needs of your learning community. And we're going to be going through these steps live in our kind of Q&A session. We're going to do a little bit of a live game design. So we hope that you can join us for that. But we want to take a moment to just talk about these with some examples now, if you would like to start kind of thinking about and designing some of your own games and activities. So the first one really ties into what Kathleen has been talking about, and it's around cultivating this self-reflection and willingness to learn. So what do I know about this topic? What are my limitations? What is kind of my own history and identity, and how that relates to my perspective and my kind of limited view? So having that, really intentionally taking that time, and maybe it's in partnership with someone else, to kind of have dialogue around that self-reflection, and keeping that willingness to learn and excitement to learn with other people really alive in you. So the next thing we talk about is identifying a need in your community. So what does my community need? Is it some concept? Is it just an introduction to how the restorative paradigm differs? Is it a specific skill need? So, for example, is it a need to talk about how can we come up with really creative, non-punitive agreement ideas? Or to understand how needs lead to behavior, so how kind of problematic behavior is rooted in unmet needs. So think about, what is the thing that my community needs a chance to really experience and dialogue around, to understand better or to practice a skill. Identify that need, and then a companion learning objective. So maybe it's, I want my community to be able to understand how needs lead to behavior and how to understand that in the restorative practice process. Or I want my community to understand how to come up with really great, creative, smart agreement ideas to repair harm that don't cause further harm. And the next step is to get creative. So think about, what are the models or what are the metaphors that I could draw on in my game design? So you'll see the image here, this really lovely illustration is of our activity out of the box. And so that's a metaphor, right? We've all are kind of familiar with the idea of thinking outside the box. And so we use a literal box that people stand in and have to free themselves from in this game for coming up with really good, creative, strengths-based agreement ideas. And so we're kind of using that metaphor that is familiar with people in a fun, engaging, really physical way to talk about this need of coming up with creative agreement ideas. Example of a model. So I mentioned kind of this need of, I need my community to understand how needs lead to behavior and how behavior is rooted in unmet needs. So a model that I really like for that is the Te Whare Tapawha model, which learned about in New Zealand. It's a Maori health model for understanding human needs and how they relate to each other. And it's, the image is kind of a house and there's 4 walls leaning on one another. And so we have Kathleen showing another beautiful illustration of that game in the book. And so the activity involves, using a scenario and identifying the kind of 4 walls of this house and writing out the needs specific to each and actually physically building that house together, the individual's needs. So how can we be creative and use models, use metaphors to kind of go deep with our learning experience? Then you're designing the experience. So you're thinking about the tone, you're thinking about how I'll describe it, thinking about how I'll run it as a facilitator. And with that, kind of step 5, how am I going to debrief it? So what are the questions? How am I going to set up the debrief afterwards so that we can really be getting as much as possible out of that dialogue and going as deep as possible with the learning? And then always, after you've had the chance to workshop it with people or then delivered it for the first time in a training or a class, how can I improve it? So reviewing what went really well, what were some of the stumbling blocks or the things that were unexpectedly great or didn't go as well as I thought, and how can I keep refining each time? So that commitment to always be approaching as a learner in every single sense of the word, and thinking, how can I keep learning my craft of how to approach this teaching role as a facilitator and make it kind of the best learning experience it can be.
Thanks. Yeah, something that I'm just thinking about as Lindsay's speaking is how consistent we want to bring this spirit of curiosity to, just like we bring curiosity to a restorative justice process. How can we show up with that same spirit of curiosity about the subject matter that we're teaching? How can we be curious about what we can learn in the moment, even if it means sort of setting aside our agenda and our rigid time constraints and being present to the spontaneous learning that's taking place while still maintaining boundaries and moving a training or a learning experience along. Much of what Lindsay just described also sort of applies to how to create a complete learning experience, a training day or a class that's an hour or 2 long, how to design that kind of full course using a mixed approach, a blended approach between instruction and experiential. And one of the main points that we want to share with you is that it's important to be intentional about creating an arc to the learning experience. So you don't want to start the day with an activity that's going to push everyone right to the edge of their comfort zone, or you'll probably lose a lot of engagement and lose potentially a lot of respect and trust in that setting. So for example, at LCJP, the organization that I lead, we will often use an activity called shovel face, where a certain amount of trust needs to be developed to have gotten there right after lunch, maybe even on the second day of a 2-day training. And that is when people can really start being more vulnerable, start taking greater risks, and it helps knit the group together even more deeply. And then we'll end the day, the training day, with a game like Race to Reframe, which is challenging, so it builds on the skills that we've been teaching over the course of the training, but it's also really fun. There's a lightness, there's also a spirit of sort of fun competition. So it helps learners feel like they're leaving on a high note. They've worked together, it's a team-based game, there's often a lot of laughter, and so it inspires that internalizing, that digesting of like, okay, what am I going to do next? I want to carry this forward. How can I use this even outside of my formal role as a restorative practitioner? Just like debriefing a game like Lindsay just described, it's also really important to take some space and then return to debrief your class or training with whoever else was part of co-facilitating with you. Ideally, get feedback and evaluation from the participants as well, so that when you're planning to deliver that training or that course again, you can integrate what you've learned and bring new energy and new spirit and do it even better the next time.
So like I mentioned, we're going to be holding a live Q&A session slash game design that we're hoping will be really collaborative and based on needs that you may have in your community. We can kind of draw on the ideas and wisdom of the people gathered. So we would love for you to join us. That's going to be on Monday, August 31st, and we have a few different time zones listed there, and hopefully you can find yours. The information is also on our page for the conference site. So please join us. We would love the chance to build some relationship with you and have some dialogue. This kind of method of pre-recorded video is really different than what we usually do. And so we're eager to have the chance to really get to know you and to engage in some conversation. But thank you so much for watching this video. We also encourage you to check out the little book of restorative teaching tools. We go into a lot greater depth about everything we've covered today and more, with a lot more specifics in the book, and we hope that you enjoy it if you check it out. And we also encourage you to visit our website. So the website came to be because the little book is a little book, and so we couldn't fit all the games and activities that we wanted to fit in the book. So we needed a space to continue sharing. So it's a collection of additional games and activities for building relationships, for helping learners to understand the restorative philosophy and paradigm, and also for learning kind of different skills and concepts and ideas related to restorative practices. And so there's a lot of different games with kind of PDF instructions that you can print off there. And while you're on the website, you can also sign up for our Game of the Month. So we send out a newsletter every month with a brand new game or activity that we're designing. Right now, like Kathleen mentioned, we're thinking a lot about racial justice issues and how can restorative practices always be approached through a racial justice lens. And so we're working to develop new games and activities that help us to kind of encourage that reflection in the field for ourselves and for others. So please sign up for that. We're also doing all games that can be played online right now due to the circumstances that most of us are in, needing to teach and train online. And finally, next summer, July 26th to 31st, we're going to be offering a training on restorative teaching tools. So we'll be sharing a lot of these games and activities, have practice facilitating them, and then also encouraging learners to design their own games and activities, kind of workshop different training or classroom designs, and really a chance to dive deep into this approach to teaching restorative practices. And we can't wait. It's at Sunrise Ranch in Colorado, which that's a real picture of the beautiful Sunrise Ranch. It's a real Colorado sunset. So in addition to being a great learning experience, we hope it'll also be a chance to kind of have a sense of retreat and be rejuvenating on hopefully multiple levels. So we would love for you to join us. There's more information on that course on our website as well. So thank you so much for your attention, for watching this video, and we hope to have the chance to continue to engage with you moving forward.
And please send us your questions, anything that you want to clarify on the chat, on our page from the conference, and we'll do our best to either answer those in writing or bring them back into our Q&A session, which hopefully we can make available online via our website as well. So we really do want to hear from you. We want the games and activities that we develop to be coming from needs that we know you have as practitioners. So don't be shy and let us know what your challenges are and where you want to really increase your experiential learning opportunities in the field of restorative practices.
Thank you so much.